So I'd like to welcome everyone, participants of the World Investment Forum, to this session on corporate governance and sustainable investment. And we're very pleased to be organizing this session in partnership with the International Corporate Governance Network, the ICGN, which is a very long-standing institution. Carrie, I don't want to give the entire history of it because that's a long history, but I've had the pleasure to be working with ICGN on and off for almost 2 decades now. It is a very well-established institution. And in this world today, where we talk about sustainable finance and ESG, we should remember that the E and the S are built on the foundation of the G, the governance. And that's an area that ICGN has been active in, again, for many decades now. And so we're very honored and pleased to have you with us and to be partnering with you on this session. So Carrie is the CEO of ICGN. We've got a great panel here. I'll leave it to Carrie to introduce the panel. Carrie, I give the floor to you.
Thanks so much, Anthony, and it's a real pleasure to work with you again in particular. We had a fantastic event together back in June, and as you say, we've got a very strong relationship with the Sustainable Stock Exchange Initiative, and we're delighted to be here at the World Investment Forum, so thank you very much. As you said, we've convened some really fantastic speakers today. Alessandra Stablini serves on the board of the European Confederation of Directors Associations, which enables us to have a really fantastic corporate perspective on the panel. Ian Berger is Head of Corporate Governance and Stewardship at Newton Investment Management. And Osama Hamada is Director of Corporate Governance Reform at the Financial Services Agency. So we have a top team to talk about the emerging issues of the day. And what we'd really like to focus is on corporate governance and sustainability. For those of you who might not know who ICGN is or what ICGN is, we were established over 25 years ago now to advance the highest standards of corporate governance and investor stewardship worldwide, and led by investors responsible for assets of around $59 trillion. Our members are based in over 40 countries, primarily North America and Europe, but also with growing representation in Asia and particularly in Japan. So as a context for this discussion today, what we thought we would do is to focus on the latest changes to the ICGN's global governance principles. These principles were first introduced in 2001, and they were updated this year and approved by our members last month at our AGM. Now, they're really important because many of our members use the ICGN principles as a bellwether for their voting policies and company engagements. And many national governments and regulators also use the principles to help inspire the evolution of national codes. But before we get started, I think it's just helpful to remind ourselves of what we mean by corporate governance and how it relates to the concept of sustainability. Fundamentally, corporate governance is a system by which companies are directed and controlled based on the principles of fairness, accountability, responsibility, and transparency. And this is imperative to ensure investor confidence, efficient capital allocation, and effectively functioning capital markets. So boards are responsible for promoting the long-term success of companies through managerial oversight, strategic direction, risk oversight and reporting. And investors are responsible for holding boards to account for this through company monitoring, voting, and engagement, otherwise known today as stewardship responsibilities. But ICGN takes the position that ultimately both companies and investors share a mutual responsibility to preserve and enhance long-term corporate value. And in doing so, they must focus not only on the aspects relating to a company's financial value, but also on factors impacting the health of society, the environment, and the economy. So in essence, this is all about the governance of sustainability and the role of the board in overseeing the integration of financial, human, and natural capital management in alignment with the company's purpose and long-term strategy. And I like to refer to the definition published by the European High-Level Expert Group on Sustainable Finance in 2019 to define sustainability, when they said it means making economic prosperity long-lasting, more socially inclusive, and less dependent on the exploitation of finite resources and the natural environment. So with this in mind, let's dive into our discussions. And as I said earlier, there are literally dozens of changes to ICGN's principles this year, with a greater focus on corporate purpose, stakeholder relations, human capital management, sustainability reporting, and so on. But Osamu, the Japan Corporate Governance Code this year has also undergone a comprehensive review. So I'd be really interested to hear more about the sustainability related elements of the review in Japan.
Yeah, thank you, Carissa. So please let me briefly introduce the revision of Japan's corporate governance code this year about sustainability. We revised Japan's corporate governance code this June with Kerry-san's great contribution as a member of the expert council. As to the revision on sustainability, as to the revision overall, there are 3 key points this time: enhancing board independence, promoting diversity, and attention to sustainability and ESG. As to the third point, sustainability issues, the new code now requires listed companies to establish a basic policy on sustainability and disclose their initiatives on sustainability. Also, the new CG code further requires companies listed on the prime market of the Tokyo Stock Exchange to enhance the quality and quantity of climate-related disclosure based on TCFD recommendation or equivalent international frameworks. Here, the Tokyo Stock Exchange will restructure the current 4 market divisions into 3 market segments: the prime market, standard market, and growth market on next April. After that, prime market listed companies will be required to make a disclosure in accordance with the new CG code and TCFD recommendations. Such a move in Japan can be viewed as in line with those in the UK. As all of you may be already aware, for instance, the UK now requires UK premium listed companies to make disclosures in line with TCFD recommendations on a comply or explain basis. And the FCA has proposed to extend the application of such a disclosure requirement to the UK standard listed companies. Also, the finance ministers and central bank governors of the G7 has announced this June that they support moving towards mandatory climate disclosures based on the TCFD framework. In this regard, climate-related disclosure rules will likely be enhanced in the near future on global basis.
Thanks, Osamu, and congratulations on such a comprehensive review of Japan's code. I mean, I encourage everybody to read it. There's a lot of very innovative focus in there, particularly on human capital management, and as Osamu said, TCFD. But of course, now the focus is on incorporating these excellent principles into practice, and particularly, Alessandra, this is really where investors will be looking at the role of the board in incorporating these policy changes. And there's been an awful lot happening in Europe recently, particularly the consultation on the governance of sustainability, and that question around the degree to which directors should be held accountable and liable when they harm human rights, the environment, and good governance. Well, we'd be interested to hear how this is being interpreted by ECODA and how that's affecting the role and responsibilities of the board in general.
Thank you very much, Kerry. And before I answer your question, let me apologize with all audience for my voice. I have a cold, unfortunately, so please forgive me. My voice is not very nice to hear. Other than that, yes, a lot is happening in Europe. And you correctly mentioned both the due diligence side and the sustainable corporate governance side on which the Commission is also working. ECODA is very actively participating in this process. We have made our voice heard with the Commission during all this year, I would say. What is ECODA position on the issue? I think that no one can seriously at this point in time and at this stage of the discussion doubt that the board of directors has a duty to be clear in its strategic choices in terms of promoting the long-term value of the firm. that the board must make a commitment towards the company's stakeholders in this respect. And the world must also be clear with the investors and the stakeholders at large on what its priorities are. So I don't think that we can doubt, and certainly ECODA does not doubt regarding this. The point, I think, is how to best reach this goal. And this is, I think, the center of the discussion in this moment on the Commission's table and on all the table of the organizations that deal with these issues. One thing that I think is important to point out, and we have done this as ECODA, is that when you talk about long-term value creation and stakeholder interest, you must be clear on one thing, and this is that stakeholders are not a homogeneous category. So there are a lot of different stakeholders who have different interests, as much as it is the case for shareholders who are not all the same in turn. So from my perspective, this leads to the conviction that probably one of the most powerful tools that we have to ensure a sustainable corporate governance is, I think, engagement, both with investors and with stakeholders. Engagement has a lot of, I think, good features. First, it makes conflicts explicit. Second, it makes trade-offs explicit. And third, helps the board to make credible commitments to both shareholders and stakeholders. In this respect, I think that the concept of a corporate purpose, which is also at the center of the debate now, so the idea of introducing an obligation for the board to disclose the purpose of the corporation, I think that this concept is also an important part of the picture, provided that it is coupled with engagement. Otherwise, it risks to remain a very ambiguous concept, and it risks to lead to less accountable rather than more accountable board. I would only add a word on due diligence, since you also touched on this, Kerry. Once again, I think, and ECODA believes that, once again, the idea of introducing some sort of due diligence obligation on companies is very serious and probably unavoidable. Once again, it is a question of how to tackle the problem. In this respect, I would say just a couple of very brief, I would have just a couple of very brief comments. The first is we have to be very careful in designing the obligation and the related liabilities, because it is not obvious that all companies can have full control of their value chain. So it's probably more productive to work on a risk-based method. And second, I think it is very important, once again, that due diligence obligations are the result of a dialogue between all interested parties, governments, NGOs, companies, unions, and so on. This, once again, would make the result more credible for all the parties involved.
Thanks, Alessandra. And you said a lot of things there that have been addressed in ICGN's principles. It's very interesting that you talk about the due diligence discussion at the moment, particularly supply chain due diligence and the role of the board in overseeing that. And I know that's going to be a topic of conversation for ICGN. But also, I mean, ICGN would see that it's the role of the board is to promote the success of the company itself, but it's only really shareholders that can hold that company to account most effectively, which is a nice segue into Ian, who is our investor on the panel. We'd be really interested, Ian, to hear from you in terms of the evolving nature of investor fiduciary duties and the extent to which sustainability is being hardwired into that, and what that means in practice, as Alessandra was saying, in terms of engagement with companies.
Yeah, thanks, Kerry. Look, I think maybe just give you a quick bit of context. I'm working at Newton Investment Management, have done for the last couple of decades, always on that responsible investment, stewardship, ESG side of things. So I've got a little bit of corporate history and experience in that. And with Newton is a long-term, long-only active investor. So arguably engagement and the whole sort of stewardship debate fits really nicely with our business model. So I just wanted to give you that little bit of context. I think the world of engagement over the last couple of decades has changed significantly. I think investors are starting to recognize that they can have an influence. They are a crucial stakeholder in the debate. They are only one, but they are a very significant one. And if one thinks about sort of climate change as an example, where there are clearly the investor community is a significant stakeholder in furthering that debate, given the capital flows that are required to address the climate change issue and moving to a lower carbon economy. But I think one thing is not necessarily to overstate what engagement is and what impact you can have engaging as an investor. We are, as I say, we are one of the stakeholders. But it's really kind of understanding that we are engaging not necessarily always to influence companies. We're engaging, particularly for Newton, as I say, as an active manager, we're engaging for information, and often that is ahead of investing. So that part of that due diligence process that we do, that mosaic theory around investment, that we're investing with our eyes wide open, understanding what we're buying ahead of committing our clients' capital to these companies. So we're looking at that risk-reward trade-off. One of the things I'm crucially aware of is and we've sort of touched on it here, is around those standards and frameworks, and ultimately the data that comes via those or gets published via those. So the danger really is that if you are solely relying upon data, that you're then focused largely on the larger cap companies, those that have got the time, the resources to be able to produce those data points, and those ever increasing number of data points that investors are requiring around those subjects like biodiversity, human capital, supply chains, and the myriad of other areas. Yes, we want them to, and we look at them and we use them, but part of engagement as well for us is to influence, but it's also to identify more information. So to ensure that we don't have that large cap bias necessarily within our portfolio, that our investment universe is widened, and that through engagement we can widen our potential investment universe. And one, not necessarily wanting to generalize, but often we find in those emerging market situations where it's the smaller companies that are doing a huge amount on sustainable initiatives, not necessarily through the products, those are and the services that they're offering, that's generally fairly obvious, but really in the practices and that good governance approach that we're looking for and seeking to get comfort from. We can get that through engagement, and it's to encourage then those companies to really disclose information around it. As I say, they're often doing a lot of good work. They're simply not telling the market about it. And that's an absolute miss, particularly with investor focus and clearly wider stakeholder groups on all things ESG and the governance area, really sort of that focus. And I think Anthony mentioned it at the very beginning, Kerry's talked about it too, that we look down to ENS through a governance lens in that initial sense, and to ensure that we've got this board accountability and that corporate purpose drives down through the business, and that's what we're looking for. Ultimately, we're trying to get a grip on what that corporate culture is and how embedded that is within throughout the company. There's a lot to talk about, Kerry, but I'll let me pause there.
Yeah, so I mean, what are the challenges, Ian, to engagement, and Alessandra? I mean, you know, Osamu sets this beautiful roadmap, if you like, through the code. and there's lots of, as in ICGN's code, lots of principles there for companies to follow. But what do you see? What's your top challenge to engagement? How can it be improved upon? And the same question to Alessandra.
Yeah, I think well, with engagement, I have sort of 7 kind of principles of what I think constitutes successful engagement. Things like the reputation of the organization that's engaging, looking at credibility of the arguments that you're putting forward, and a variety of others. I think honestly the biggest challenge for us is identifying where we deploy our limited resources. I think today I have a team of 15 people with AUM of around 140 billion US. Now, even if I had a team of 500 people, I still wouldn't be able to do all the engagement perhaps that I might want to do. And so really it's about prioritizing those and systematically looking through and identifying where you want to spend your time and energy. So that's perhaps the key, the first challenge, and that's an internal challenge and something clearly I can overcome. I think the bigger challenge, or a big challenge, is really the reality of and the practical sense of getting time in front of these companies. I think over the course of the last 18 months with COVID, we've learned that, like we are today, we're sat on a virtual platform, and that has been a huge benefit for engaging. So in the morning, I can be talking to a company in Japan. In the afternoon, I can be talking to a company on the east coast of the US. In the evening, I could be talking to somebody on the west coast of the US, and all in one day, when ordinarily I would have spent sort of 3-4 weeks traveling around the world engaging with companies. Now that to me has been a huge benefit, and that's been able to sort of tackle that challenge. So yeah, really for priorities.
And would you concur with that, Alessandra, that it's mainly around resources as a key engagement challenge?
Well, certainly yes. On the investor side, I would agree what Ian was saying. I want to add another element, though, and another complexity to the discussion. I think from the director's perspective, the challenge is twofold. First, directors must, first of all, invest resources in understanding their shareholder base, which is not something that boards typically explicitly engage in doing. And I think this is very important. First, directors must invest their time and resources in understanding who their shareholders and, of course, stakeholders are. And second, I think engagement must be done both sides on the basis of a transparent disclosure of the goals of the engagement. And here I would like to throw a coin to Ian. I think investors should be transparent on the goals of engagement. And once again, they should help director to understand the different perspectives and interests that investors have. And I think we need the help of investors in this respect.
That's a very good point. And actually it's something we'll ruminate on, Ian, at ICGN. But the Japan FSA actually published a fantastic piece of engagement guidelines, literally articulating questions that overseas investors might consider when engaging with Japan-based companies. But from a regulatory perspective, Osamu, what do you see as the biggest challenges? What are you expecting of that new prime market in April? How are you going to make those policies become practice?
Yeah, thank you, Carissa. Yeah, it's a very important point, and yeah, we should carefully monitor and follow up how companies will respond to their disclosure obligations in terms of sustainability. I also say, I fully agree with Ian and Alessandra's point. Engagement would be a key in order to keep directors accountable. And in order to have effective engagement, disclosure with transparent and reliable manner is also an essential basis for would be an essential basis for engagement. Yeah, we are now with the JFSA currently established another expert council called Disclosure Working Group, and now discusses about requiring companies to enhance their disclosures on sustainability issues by updating our disclosure rules. We hope that the efforts will contribute to a more transparent, reliable, and better functioning capital markets in response to climate change and other sustainability issues.
So I think the point around sustainability reporting and the adequacy of that reporting and the assurance of it is a whole world of challenge, but something that we must all grapple. And just to you, Samu, I mean, ICGN wholeheartedly supports the proposed establishment of the International Sustainability Standards Board. Is this something Japan FSA will be supporting, given your commitment to TCFD, for example? So to Osamu.
Yes. I'm sorry for the lag. Yes, Japan officially supported during TCFD recommendations and also declared to support the IFAS Foundation's efforts toward establishing International Sustainability Standards Board and forming global comparable sustainability standards with the help of TCFD frameworks. Ensuring comparability is an essential factor in terms of corporate reporting. Fragmented approach tends to bring inefficiency and increased cost and lack of trust. So Japan has more than 400 organizations which declared support to TCFD recommendations, and we will keep such support and further back up the IFAS Foundation's current efforts in this regard.
So, Ian, I know you're quite excited about the prospect of the ISSB being established, but what is it that you're hoping to gain from that? What kind of information do you hope will become better harmonized as a result of improved sustainability reporting? I mean, we've talked about climate, so perhaps we could think more holistically about sustainability related information in the round. What more should companies be doing from an investor perspective? Yeah,
look, I'm definitely a huge fan of what the ISSB can potentially achieve. I appreciate it will be over the long course of time, and we need a framework, and we've got a number of frameworks in place in the interim to help fill that gap. But fundamentally, and it's going to Salmo's point around having consistency of data, that we can compare those apples with apples rather than kind of apples with oranges. And I think if anybody on the call has looked at kind of revenue or SDG alignment of their portfolios, trying to do that from a revenue perspective, or even an OPEX or a CAPEX arrangement, and it's hugely challenging because of those massive data gaps. One ends up taking massive assumptions, or can potentially take massive assumptions within that, and what that clearly that creates from a data perspective is you've got poor information going in, you're going to get poor results ultimately, or not necessarily the whole and accuracy that you're really looking for. So that I'm hugely hopeful that the ISSB will be able to help bridge that gap and provide some level of consistency within that market, so that we can legitimately and comfortably and accurately and rigorously report to our clients as an asset manager, report to my clients as asset owners, the impact that we're having from a sustainable perspective with the investments we're undertaking on their behalf. I think that is my kind of utopia in that sort of midterm time frame.
And Alessandra, how do companies feel about this? Do they feel overwhelmed? Do they feel it's doable? Do they feel they are providing the information required for investment decision making? What more can be done on the corporate side?
Well, I think that companies, at least large companies, have fully internalized the idea of reporting on sustainability issues. And I also believe that on the company's side too, there is a favorable acceptance of the need for standardization of reporting. This is crucial because otherwise you risk to have a reporting that is neither helpful nor credible somehow. What we have discussed within ECODA is the extent to which you want to go with standardization. Here, I see potentially two issues. One is business sectors. You might need to have different standards depending on different sectors, and this is something that ECODA has underlined also during the consultation process with the European Union's institutions. My other point is that you might want to leave a little room for experimenting within companies, especially I think on the on the S and on the G areas of the ESG, because for environment, I think that we are at a point where standardization is relatively easier. For the other two dimensions, I think that we still need a little time to find the criteria and to benefit from companies experimenting what the relevant criteria are.
And I do think that's an important point, is truly understanding and defining what we mean by these concepts. Most recently, ICGN has developed two new policy committees, one focused purely on human capital management and one on natural capital management. And so for natural capital, it's not just about climate change, it's looking at biodiversity, water scarcity, pollution. And so I think it is important that we do define what we mean by these so that we're able to then get to a point where we're able to enhance engagement through better disclosure of these points. But one of the most poignant issues of the day, of course, is climate change. And we have COP26 coming up in just over a week's time. ICGN yesterday published a statement of what we call a statement of shared responsibilities for climate change. And we consulted with our members, we had a great response, and we've articulated priorities for companies, for investors, for the auditing profession and for regulators in terms of what we think they should be all focused upon. But as a regulator, a company and investor, I'd be very interested to hear your personal view on what is your number one or three priorities for addressing climate change. And perhaps, Osama, we can come to you first.
Yeah, thank you, Carissa. Yeah, it is a bit difficult for me to express my personal opinions as a public servant. But yeah, as to Japan's policies, the government of Japan has declared that Japan would realize carbon neutrality by 2015. In accordance with the policy, many ministries and government agencies are now making efforts, such as ministries of environment and other relevant ones. Have published such statements such as roadmap to zero carbon and Japan's green growth strategy. As a financial regulator, the FSA is now prioritizing to monitor and follow up how companies will respond to the TCFD disclosure requirement next year. And also, as I mentioned earlier, we formed a disclosure working group and now discusses about updating our disclosure rules in terms of sustainability issues. We hope that the efforts will contribute to a more transparent, will contribute to achieve transparency in climate change issues.
And I think, as our Queen here in the UK would say, it's about putting these policies into action. She was heard privately, a private conversation from the Queen was picked up saying this. But Ian, from an investor perspective, what do you think is your own priority? What do you need to be doing as an investor to contribute towards net zero carbon emission transitions by 2050? And what's your expectation on companies?
Yeah, what do we need to be doing? Well, we've been clearly talking with our clients. We're recognizing what their demands or dreams, ambitions are around climate change, and there's a greater emphasis on how we manage and how we're exposed to that key risk. And from a core perspective, it's really for us through that mosaic theory of investment of understanding what are the risks that we're taking on with investing in companies that might not necessarily be aligned with a 2050 net zero target. But from looking at it from a sustainable strategy perspective, and where we have a greater emphasis on avoiding companies that are high carbon emitters. And I think kind of that realization from the corporate perspective that there's more and more investment capital flowing into those types of sustainable funds. For instance, it's our largest growth area in terms of strategies for Newton. So more and more capital is going into those, so that, ergo there's less capital flowing through down to the corporate market for companies that are kind of those big heavy emitters. And look, I think fundamentally we're at a stage of a perfect storm, where I think, without diving into the finer detail, from a high level emphasis perspective, the shareholders are generally aligned. The political agendas, and that's just one area I'll pick up on in the comment, are aligned. Regulations, we've got demand from asset owners, and we've got improving data. Now, just picking up on that political agenda, and I think this is kind of the expectations around COP26. Unfortunately, currently, where I'm sitting, I'm not necessarily I don't think we're going to get the result of which I'm hoping for, which is international alignment and agreement, largely because of the geopolitical risks that exist between the US and China. And they're yet to necessarily and properly show their hands. And I think that's the crucial element, that really that piece of the puzzle that's missing at the moment. And that kind of the risk that sits behind those, behind the US and China still battling out on the political stage, I think will be the boom or bust of what could potentially come out of COP26.
Yeah, reluctantly, I agree with you, but if we can't get political alignment, then we ought to be striving for market alignment and to ensure, as you said earlier, investors, that there's pretty much consensus amongst the 60 trillion that ICGN has, for example, on this issue. But it's how do we then engage with companies to bring about the change we think is required. We've got the Climate Action 100+ initiative, for example, focused on the fossil fuel industry. But Alessandra, give us a candid view from the corporate side. Do you think enough is being done, or what more could we be doing?
Thank you, Kerry. I was looking at the ICGN statement that was issued yesterday. And I must say that I'm having a hard time in prioritizing in ranking the priorities that ICGN indicates for companies. I would probably say that probably my first priority, which is also a challenge, is the governance the governance side. ICGN correctly states that that companies need to have robust governance procedures in order to reach the sustainability goals. I think this is very true. And to me, this specifically means that companies must elevate sustainability discussions within strategic discussions. So the key here is to understand that there is no strategy and there is no risk management without talking about sustainability, which I think is very important. And my second priority here would be board competence. We come from a 20-year, let's say, faith in independent directors as the key for corporate governance. We know that lawmakers have put a lot of reliance and of faith in independent directors as a governance tool, which I think is perfectly fine and good. But we now need to insist on competence, I think, because in order to govern this process and this complexity, we need directors to be competent and to be skilled, especially because otherwise they cannot play, especially independent directors, the role of a fruitful challenge that they should play towards executives within this type of discussions. So I think this probably are the two priorities that I would choose. But of course, as I said, it's a hard choice.
Thank you. And for the benefit of our audience, each stakeholder that I mentioned, we've articulated 3 priorities. For companies, it's essentially around publicly committing to net zero targets and an action plan to achieve that, including an assessment of transition and physical and transition risks. That's point 1. Second point is around competence and governance structures. And the third point is actually around incentives, CEO incentives, alignment with the sustainability factors. And actually, I'm feeling like it would be interesting to just reflect a little bit on the other huge systemic event that's happened to all of us is the impact of COVID on governance, if you like. And I'm inspired by the thought on remuneration, because I know that's one particular area that Ian's going to be very focused on in how COVID impacts the awarding of CEO incentives. So Ian, could you just opine a little bit on CEO remuneration related to sustainability, but also to COVID, and perhaps just reflect more generally on the COVID impact from an investment perspective?
Yeah, no, happy to. Thanks, Kerry. Look, I think over the course of COVID, it has had an impact on CEO pay. It's had an impact on, I think, how investors are thinking about corporates and the corporate structures around pay, and really sort of using that word fairness, recognizing and really sort of focusing in there on that word, that our corporate pay structures fair, and that's executive as well as the wider workforce as well. And we've seen a number of good practices, and there are a number of poor practices throughout COVID. But I think one of the areas, and I don't necessarily have the statistics directly at hand, but then the number of corporate executive executive remuneration structures, compensation plans that now incorporate ESG factors has increased exponentially over the course of the last 2 years. So it's really becoming part of that motivational aspect. And one of the area where I focus in on executive pay for the motivational aspects of it. Does that structure promote and motivate the long-term success and sustainability of the organization, not the individual? And I don't necessarily look backwards as to see what the company's been doing. I'm looking forward to what it is that that pay structure is looking to motivate. And going back to kind of those engagement points, we've spoken with a number of companies about how that they can incorporate the material ESG factors into their own plans. And then we've had some really, really positive and interesting discussions, some less so. But really kind of crucially with that implementation, which I'm a big supporter of, that we've got to get to a point where essentially executives are not just simply able to meet and tick the box, as it were, of there's got to be substance behind that form. And there needs to be also a recognition of financial performance that underpins all of that over the long term. I can happily go into sort of more of the specifics, but just want to give you kind of a high level view right for now.
Can you give us one specific? I mean, we talked about the climate change, so you've got your transition plan, your interim targets, and how that's kind of easy to understand. But what's an example of a social target that you would envisage being as a metric in a CEO incentive plan?
Yeah, and I think it's often easier to look at what are the ones that aren't particularly rigorous. Those are the ones that immediately come to mind. So I've seen companies where they've had employee engagement as a performance metric. That really, if I'm driving whatever it is, 5-10% of my long-term incentive off the back of how engaged I can be with my employees, how many of them respond to my all-employee engagement surveys. That to me doesn't smack of particularly rigorous target. Really, what I'm keen to understand from that one particularly is, okay, you've done your engagement. This is the percent. You engaged with a significant majority of your workforce. These were the points that were recognized as the positives and the negatives, and this is how we're going to address the negatives, and over the course of time, how those negatives are addressed. Very difficult to really put that into a remuneration structure because of the complexities that sit around it and the nuances that exist. But there are a variety of factors that companies can consider, and really when companies come and talk to us about what they're doing, what they're likely to do, is really to get the individual company to focus in on what they think are the most material. Then we opine on the relevance or the subjectivity sort of sitting around that, where we've seen certain companies that have come to us and really kind of given us what I'd figure to be not particularly relevant to that business, or not overly relevant, and there are much more factors. So looking at that ESG and those sub-factors, there are significantly more relevant and material factors that they're just missing, that we're then offering those as perhaps consideration for what they could be thinking about incorporating.
Feels like we could do with some better information, Osamu. And I know that we had a lot of references to human capital in the Japan code this year. Interestingly, the SEC now require companies to disclose their material human capital management objectives. But I think what Ian's looking for is turnover rates, lost time injury rates, diversity, not only at the board, but through the workforce. To what extent do you think you'll move more towards that in Japan, requiring better disclosure around human capital management policies and practices?
Yeah, thank you, Kerry-san. Yeah, our corporate governance code is on principle based, so we do not set any detailed disclosure rules on that issues. But as Kerry-san correctly pointed out, injury rate or turnover rate or rate of promotion of minorities or females could be an example of such metrics, and some companies have already disclosed such KPIs on a voluntary basis. We are planning to carefully monitor and follow up those disclosures from here on.
Very interesting. And Alessandra, do you think there's a need for improvement in terms of the disclosure from companies around social practices? And do you think they are adequately aligned with CEO incentives, or could there be improvement there?
I think both dimensions are might be improved at this stage, especially for medium-sized companies rather than for large companies that are probably more advanced in this respect. I think that the human capital management and disclosure is a key factor. And if I might add, in answering a question that you didn't pose to me, but I will take the liberty to answer, I think that COVID, as we are seeing these days, these very days, has added a new dimension to human capital management. I am referring to the phenomenon known in the US as the Great Resignation. So the fact that there is a quite massive resignation by people who are not willing to go back to a workplace run by the pre-COVID rules. I think this is a new and very important dimension of human capital management, because we cannot just go back. This is not going to happen. And this is not only a question of remote working, it's much more than that. So I think that human capital management must focus on this dimension from now on. And the related disclosure must cover this aspect more and more.
That's such an excellent point. And I am immediately thinking about ICGN's own experience. We actually gave our office up. We don't have a home anymore. We have all of our individual homes, and actually we're working very efficiently, very innovatively. We get together, regularly, but it does seem to be working. So there's a bit of a kind of revolution in the workplace, I would say. But again, and thank you for reminding me, we were talking literally about the COVID impacts. I'd be interested to know one of the particular issues, and we're talking about engagement again now, for ICGN has been about infringements to shareholder rights at AGMs. And, even this month I'm hearing there are issues because of the fact that we're relying more on virtual AGMs. And it's absolutely imperative that investors are able to still engage and constructively challenge the board by virtue of asking questions or making statements at the AGM. Actually, I'll pose this to you, Osama, in the first instance. What's the future for AGMs as we're emerging out of COVID? What are you going to do to address the concerns of investors that we need to ensure this ability to vote and make statements is retained?
Yes, thank you, Carissa. Yeah. Fortunately, Japan has not experienced severe lockdown compared to other Western countries. But in Japan, people faces this difficulty in attending AGM on a physical basis, and virtual AGM have become so popular in Japan too. But as Kerry-san pointed out, as a member of our expert council, I think ensuring transparency and fairness when holding a virtual AGM would be an essential factor in order to ensure reliability and trust from investors and shareholders. We pointed out those issues in our engagement guideline based on Kerry-san's recommendations. But there may be a lot of legal issues in terms of holding an AGM in many countries, and Japan has also Japan's company law also requires having at least one physical place in order to hold an AGM, and we have just revised the law and now allows to have virtual only meetings.
We've just amended our own articles of association at ICGN to allow us to do that as well. But Ian, are you still struggling with AGMs?
The short answer is no, not really. We recognise that the world moves on. Digital solutions are required. It helps us increase our connectivity. Yes, I think there are examples of abuses of that in the AGM throughout the AGM season. I wasn't particularly, or Newton wasn't subject to those issues. In fact, really, I think from a practical sense, the biggest problem we had was the shifting of dates of AGMs, which just created kind of administrative problems for us. But otherwise, the companies that we're invested in were concentrated portfolios. We didn't have any particular issues, and welcome really that sort of move to virtual, as providing, as Kerry, as you pointed out, that there's certain mechanisms in place to ensure that there is an ability for shareholders to participate in the AGMs themselves. So that's crucial.
Thanks, Ian. And same question to Alessandra, but I'll ask you all just to, because I'm conscious of time, when we conclude, priorities for governance and will be the wrap-up question before we hand back to Anthony. But Alessandra, a quick view on AGMs?
Yeah, I tend to agree with Ian. And I would only add that at least in my experience, but this might be peculiar of Italy, I don't know. But, the COVID violent move towards a relatively less physical or totally less physical participation to shareholders meeting comes at the end of a long period of sunset for shareholders meeting in general. So shareholders meeting might not have been the center of engagement between companies and shareholders for a long time before COVID came.
That's a fair point. Osamu, priorities for the future.
Yeah, thank you. It is difficult to place priorities on the future, but the key point for to place it or encourage companies to appropriately set priorities is, as Ian mentioned, engagement and disclosure would be an essential factor in order to ensure appropriate priorities. We think that in this regard, investors' role for ensuring for promoting sustainability efforts to companies are so huge, and we expect continuous engagement to Japanese companies.
I agree with that. Ian?
Yeah, I think maybe, again, we could talk for a while, but I'll focus in on two. One is data and how we're getting access to that data, how we can use that data more efficiently to enable us to have more of an impact. So data really is a key priority for us. And then I think secondly is around reporting, recognizing that regulations have definitely moved on. You have in the UK, they have in Europe, and expected to do so more widely, where it's okay for investors to have policies and principles in place, and it's expected that you have those in place, but really demonstrating the implementation of those policies and principles through reporting. Yes, we do a significant amount of reporting, but I'm not arrogant enough to think that it can't be improved upon. It most definitely can and will be, and that's a key priority for me and Newton.
Thank you. Alessandra, over to you for the final word.
Thank you, Kerry. Well, I have referred before to engagement, so I will not repeat that. Other than that, I think the priority for boards is embed sustainability into the strategy. So strategic thinking in terms of sustainability goals. And the other word that I want to add is not to identify sustainability with resilience. We are in the era of resilience, but sustainability of business is not only resilience, it's also growth. So don't just think in terms of the resilience, because this would run off a lot of opportunities.
A fantastic note to finish on, and that leaves me to thank you all so much for these extremely interesting insights. We're very grateful. I can now hand over to Anthony, and thank you again all for these brilliant remarks. Anthony, over to you.
Yes, thank you all for the insights and the discussion. Clearly, this is a major transition, and this is a theme that's cutting across the World Investment Forum, is the impact on the transition, the sustainability transition. Indeed, in another session, someone referred to it as a revolution. It affects everything: the way we invest, the way we manufacture things, the way we produce energy, and certainly the way we govern companies. It's going to have to be integrated into that as well. I'm sorry I have to cut it off short because we have another session starting in the same virtual room momentarily. But thank you again, everyone, for joining. And remember that there will be a recorded version of this that will appear on our website. We'll probably have all of those loaded up next week sometime. So thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Brilliant. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.